Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on when you catch this. It's been a minute since I uploaded here, so I apologize for that. And right now, what you're seeing on the screen is tornadoes that have struck around the world, and that's going to actually tie into what I'm talking about. I'm going to talk about hurricanes, tornadoes, and how I believe they tie into the Atlantic slave trade, transatlantic slave trade, or the triangular slave trade. And years ago, hurricane season actually started on June 15 and actually went through October 31st, Halloween. And then more recent years, we've seen that period extend forward or backwards to June 1st and forward to November 30th. So the season's been extended. And every now and then you'll get a straggler that hits around May. And back on March 7, 1908, that was actually one that hit as well. And the first recorded hurricane, because they might have happened before then, but the first recorded hurricane touched down Hispaniola around the year 1494 or 1495, depending on what source you get it from. And the first one that ever touched down on the east coast of the United States was actually recorded in 1523 off the coast of Florida. And there's, we also have hurricanes hit over in the Pacific coast as well, on the Pacific coast as well. And the first recorded hurricane to hit the Pacific coast was actually in 1521 in Mexico. But up until 1858, no hurricanes had actually hit the western seaboard of the United States as far as I could find. And the first recorded hurricane on the West Coast actually hit San Diego in 1858. And up until that time, all of the hurricanes that actually hit the West Coast were hitting down in Mexico and Latin America. And you're going to understand why a little bit later. And Christopher Columbus actually did the bidding for King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. And they were actually the leadership of Spain at the time. And they had worldwide, well, not worldwide, but they had large power and influence at that time. And they actually wanted to increase their wealth, their power, and their influence around the world. Which is why Christopher Columbus left with the ships that they gave to him. And Columbus actually ventured into the Lower Islands down in the Caribbean, thinking he had actually went to Asia. And he actually wrote a letter to the king and queen, and he stated that he had discovered some islands down there that were inhabited by numerous people. Now, how you discover a place that's already inhabited, I don't know about that, but that's like somebody actually coming into your house. You live there already. They come in, and then they don't want to leave, talking about they discovered your house. Well, it's going to be some issues right there. And he said they could easily be conquered because they didn't have any weapons. And just like he landed in Hispaniola, Hernan Cortez started colonization of the Aztec Empire in 1519. And Mexico would be colonized in 1521. And the reason the Aztec Empire, with its vast amount of people, was able to be colonized or conquered, because they're the same thing to me, because they actually outnumbered Cortez and his crew. But Cortez and his crew brought a whole bunch of diseases with them that actually sickened the native population and wiped a large sum of them out, which virtually rendered them ineffective. Now, I'm not a meteorologist or a prophet, but I want to point something out. The majority of our hurricanes form in the Atlantic Ocean. And ironically, they follow the same pattern as the slave ship routes. Both of them start off the west coast of Africa. Now, I'm just talking about the transatlantic slave trade here, because slavery has existed in all forms, all around the world, by all people, by all cultures, by all religions. So don't sit here and talk about they hit other places, because when you look at the East African slave trade or sub-Saharan slave trade, when we look at the amount of people that died, they don't compare. Because in the transatlantic slave trade, you know, of course, you know, they didn't report everybody that, you know, jumped overboard or died or whatever. But based on cargo, you know, they were considered property, so they were cargo. They actually lost on around 10%, which is a little bit different than that East African and sub-Saharan slave trade, which lost anywhere between 80 and 90%. So, but we're talking about the transatlantic slave trade, because Africa is suffering all on her own, and not just, you know, I know Africa's a continent, but many countries in Africa are suffering as well. So the transatlantic slave trade started off the west coast of Africa, and when the first group were taken to Portugal in 1444. And the first recorded hurricane wasn't documented until 1494, 1495, some 50 years later. And even though the first documented slave owner didn't happen in the colonies until the mid 17th century, because documented slavery didn't actually take place until either 1654 or 1661, whichever one, I can't remember off the top of my head. But Columbus had actually been taking humans as chattel slaves long before then. And I know many people, even on my video, on the other video on the channel, Free Blacks Who Own Slaves, somebody said Hugh Gwynn was the first slave owner. I'm talking about documented. Because people had, like I said, people have been taking slaves long before then. Documented is the key word. The group of people that landed in the colonies in 1619 were not slaves. They were actually indentured servants. They actually offered their servitude in exchange for passage to the New World. And indentured servitude was a practice that many engaged in, whether they were black or white, if they didn't have any money to afford transportation to the New World. And so they offered to work for free for 7 years in exchange for a ride across the world. And Columbus actually plundered the islands to return fortunes to Spain, and Cortez did the same thing down in Mexico and Latin America. And you know, just in case history class misled you, just like the slaves that were taken out of Africa were black Hebrews, not black Africans, the Aztecs down in Mexico were black as well. And the meaning of the word Indian, because we're talking about Native Indian or American Indian, whichever one you want to call them, but the meaning of the word Indian actually derives from the word Indi, and Indi actually means black. And so the lands that received slaves are suffering the wrath of Mother Nature, in my opinion, because of what they did to these folks. These lands actually profited greatly off the backs of the slaves, and blacks included in that as well. Now don't start telling me blacks were only buying family members, because that wasn't true in all cases. Black slave owners in some cases were just as brutal, according to documented evidence. Now, if a black person actually had 10 or fewer slaves, we'll say they bought family, even though that still is not true in all cases. And for the person that asked on the Free Blacks Who Own Slave video, where does my source come from? Carter G. Woodson. And he has a book, and you can get it online, Free Negroes Who Own Slaves. But we'll say they want to keep the family together with 10 or few slaves. But there were many blacks who owned more than 20 slaves, and some of them even owned hundreds. And there were some free blacks already, and You know, I know people want to say, well, they were mulattoes. Well, you had mulattoes that were slaves too, so get over that too. You know, we want to claim mulatto heritage when they do well, but we don't want to claim mulatto heritage when it's a stain on the race. So get over yourself. Some slaves had bought their freedom, and they were just as harsh as I mentioned. Now, it appears to me that the mistreatment of the Hebrew slaves in the Americas that were actually taken out of Africa created a force in Mother Nature that wasn't happy. And y'all keep hearing me say Hebrew slaves because the Hebrews were the ones that were taken out of Africa. Africa wasn't warring with their own tribes until they actually ran out of Hebrews. So there was actually a doctor, Dr. Alexander Falconbridge, that actually worked on the slave ships, and then he eventually left it alone because of the mistreatment. But he even confirmed that they were Hebrew slaves. But it's a lot more to what Dr. Falconbridge said about Hebrews in Africa. But I'm not going to even get into that here. We could do a whole semester or two on teaching that. But as I mentioned, 50 years after the first slaves were actually taken out of Africa, you had the hurricanes started hitting off the west coast. Now, could hurricanes be punishment for the slave trade in all of Americas, North, Central, and South America, and the islands, because the islands are part of the Americas. And when we think of America, we only think about United States. We don't think about North America, including Canada and Mexico as well. But you got Central and South and Latin America. All those are Americas. But hurricanes actually also form in the Pacific Ocean. Sorry about that. And if we study the word Pacific, find the meaning of the word Pacific, we actually see that Pacific means peaceful or tranquil. I mean, how many times have you heard about devastation caused by hurricanes in the Pacific Ocean hitting the west coast of the United States? You don't hear about it that often. And if you Atlantic Ocean, hurricanes forming in the Atlantic Ocean actually go by the name storm and petrel, which actually means trouble. And what do hurricanes cause? They cause a whole bunch of trouble. You know, all of America's accepted and received slaves, and look at the years of destruction, free labor, and that the slaves had to perform, and the slave masters imposed on them. You know, the slave masters enjoyed that free slave labor. And just recently it was found that a former slave named Nearest Green actually created Jack Daniels. He was the originator of Jack Daniels whiskey. And for 150 years, this has been absent from Jack Daniels history. And the global brand ambassador for Jack Daniels said they weren't intending to hide it. Well, why we just not finding out about it? You know, you figure it out for yourself. And, you know, I saw a video where actually some of the Jack Daniels descendants met with some of Green's descendants. And, you know, they were sitting there happy, but I think what would make a whole lot happy if they would share some of those profit with Green's family. You know, shareholders of the Jack Daniels group of companies actually got $718 million in fiscal year 2015. So they could break the Green family off a little some of that. I mean, they've been profiting off that free labor all this time. And I mean, if you think about it, Jack Daniels, you know, is a product that many people enjoy, and so they patented Green's idea as well. You know, but oh well. But even after slavery had actually officially ended, there was a system put in place called prison leasing. And this system actually allowed prison wardens to loan out blacks to their friends that own these plantations and that had just lost that free labor to the 13th Amendment. And what they would do, law enforcement was part of it, and they actually would turn misdemeanors into felonies for blacks. And something as simple as whistling in public by a black was actually turned into a felony. And they actually had to remain in this system until their trumped up charges were actually paid off. And many of these guys actually died in prison because the warden kept upping the amount of their repayment efforts. And, you know, America has profited greatly. They abused the slaves, and then they just threw them out on their own without personal compensation. And look at the natural devastation that America suffers from each and every year. I mean, not a year goes by without some type of natural disaster destroying America. And, you know, although most of the devastation from hurricanes happens along the eastern seaboard, which ironically is where the 13 colonies are, the states that represent the Midwestern United States don't escape the wrath of Mother Nature either. And practically every year, these Midwestern states suffer enormous damage from tornadoes. I mean, tornadoes are actually more feared and more destructive than hurricanes when we think about it. But after the Constitution and Bill of Rights and all that started to be put into place, the slave trade actually expanded into some of these Midwestern states. And so they're suffering as well. And if we pay attention, hurricanes are the strongest when that warm air meets that warm water and an atmospheric pressure is at the right point. And they actually weaken when they cross land. And for over 200 years, the Americas and the colonies enjoyed enormous financial gains at the expense of a people they deem less than human. Now look at the cost of what hurricanes and tornadoes have cost America over the centuries, and the loss of life, the loss of property, the loss of families, and the loss of money. I mean, it's people that disappeared in Katrina. Family members still haven't found them yet to this day. And, you know, maybe they want to maybe that was the perfect opportunity to disappear on purpose, and they're still around somewhere. But, you know, I guess it's kind of hard when you have that much water coming into an area and they can pull so many bodies back out to sea that it'll never be found, you know. But I don't know. You know, we saw that the Galveston hurricane in 1900, they documented over 8,000 lost lives. And, you know, New Orleans pretty much still is in recovery mode from Katrina. You know, Hurricane Andrew was devastating financially. And, you know, how many of you can remember just, what was that, 2-3 years ago, Hurricane Sandy? They called that the super hurricane or something they called it. And what about the super tornado outbreak of 2011? More than 1,000 tornadoes touched down in that year alone. And this is what's recorded in the book of Baruch. Baruch is one of those books of the Bible that was actually removed years and years and years ago. But in Baruch chapter 4, verses 31 to 33, this is what it records. Misery will fall upon those who mistreated you and celebrated your fall. Misery will fall upon the cities that enslave your young. Misery will fall upon the cities that receive your children. Just as the enemy celebrated your fall and rejoiced at your misfortune, she herself will feel the pain of being left desolate.